On the 28th of February 2026, an airstrike brought an end to an era. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a religious zealot who ruled Iran for a full 37 years, was killed in the explosion. From taking power in 1989 to falling at the very heart of authority today, this supreme leader who ruled Iran in the name of theocracy for nearly 40 years has finally had his chapter quietly turned over by the mighty hand of history. Yet what he leaves behind is an Iranian economy battered by sanctions, millions of Iranians exiled overseas, young people who died in the streets during wave after wave of protest, and countless Iranian families permanently broken. Today, the dust has yet to settle in Iran, but it is nevertheless the most fitting moment to look back on the life of this dictator. How did he rise from being an ordinary cleric during the revolutionary era to the very pinnacle of power? And how did he, over the course of decades, turn the whole of Iran into his own personal prison? Today, we shall talk about the life of Khamenei, his 37-year journey under the rule of the clergy. In 1939, Khamenei was born into a middle-class Shia family in the northeastern Iranian city of Mashhad. Mashhad is one of the most important religious cities in Iran, home to the Imam Reza Shrine, which attracts tens of millions of pilgrims every year. Born here, Khamenei began attending the traditional Maktab school at the age of 4, studying the Quran and Arabic. In his teenage years, he entered the Mashhad seminary, embarking on the path of a professional cleric. At the age of 19, he made a decision that would change his life, to leave Mashhad and head to Qom. Qom is the heart of Shia theology in Iran, where the country's most important religious scholars are gathered. It was in Qom that Khamenei met Ruhollah Khamenei. At that time, Khomeini was already a radical anti-monarchist scholar, openly opposing the rule of the then Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. For the 19-year-old Khamenei, that encounter was decisive. Khomeini not only became his mentor, but also the spiritual compass for the rest of his life. 1963 was the year Khamenei truly stepped into history. That year, the Shah launched the White Revolution, introducing land reforms, granting women the right to vote, and seeking to secularize education. On the surface, these were modernizing reforms, but in reality, they served to consolidate pro-Western power and directly undermine the interests of the religious class. Khamenei led the protests, calling on the entire nation to oppose them. At the age of 24, Khamenei distributed Khomeinei's leaflets on the streets of Mashhad, which brought him to the attention of SAVK. SAVK was the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's secret police at the time, notorious for their brutal methods. Khamenei was soon arrested and imprisoned in Tehran. During interrogation, he refused to cooperate. According to his fellow inmates, he comforted others in prison with poetry. That was his first time in prison, but it would not be his last. From 1963 until the victory of the revolution in 1979, he was arrested at least 6 times and was even exiled to the remote town of Iranshah in central Iran. During his exile, Khamenei did not cease his underground activities. He secretly organised clandestine lectures and continued to spread revolutionary ideas. Such experiences were not uncommon among that generation of the Iranian Revolution. Many had spent time in Savak's prisons. However, it is worth noting that the oppression and exile of his early years left Khamenei with more than just revolutionary zeal. It also instilled in him an acute sensitivity to dissent. He had experienced the sting of repression himself, yet that period did not later inspire sympathy for dissenters. On the contrary, it pushed him in quite the opposite direction. In 1979, Khomeini returned to Iran and the revolution triumphed, but at that time Iranian society was in turmoil, with various factions, Islamists, leftists, nationalists and liberals, all vying for power. Khamenei was the supreme leader, but it was his followers who carried out the actual work, among whom was Khamenei. Khamenei was immediately appointed to the Revolutionary Council, becoming Deputy Minister of Defense and Khamenei's representative on the Supreme Defense Council. He briefly commanded the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and took part in negotiations with the Americans during the Iran hostage crisis. Later, Khamenei was appointed as the Friday prayer leader in Tehran, which is an extremely important position. Every week he was able to preach to thousands at the Mosque of Tehran University, effectively serving as Khamenei's official voice. At the time, standing at that pulpit, he spoke about religion, revolution, the knowledge of the poor, and even women's education, giving the impression of a pragmatic revolutionary who cared about society. But at the same time, he had already begun to reveal a hard-line and violent side. He started to tolerate and even support violent purges against the opposition. In 1981, Khamenei was elected president of Iran. This was the first time he stepped into the spotlight, moving from behind the scenes to become an official leader of the country. When Khamenei took office, the Iran-Iraq war had already broken out. Saddam Hussein's troops were advancing from the west, Iranian cities were being bombed, and the economy was beginning to collapse. To be honest, his early performance was widely regarded as representative of the pragmatist camp. In 1982, after Iranian forces repelled the Iraqi invasion in the Battle of Khorramshahr, Khamenei pushed for a limited counteroffensive. At the same time, he secretly authorized the then Foreign Minister, Velayati, to negotiate a ceasefire with the United Nations and Arab countries. According to recollections, at a cabinet meeting, Khamenei told the hardliners that war is not an eternal holy struggle. We need to be realistic. People are bleeding and the economy is collapsing. He subsequently approved the United Nations draft resolution in 1982, attempting to end the conflict through diplomacy. Although in the end, it was vetoed by Khamenei. During the same period, Khamenei even publicly expressed support for women's education, saying that women's education is a source of national strength and allowing more women to enter university, which at the time was considered a relatively enlightened stance. However, as the Iran-Iraq war reached a stalemate, Khamenei's character began to change. In 1984 and 1985, Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian cities, resulting in a large number of civilian deaths. The brutality of the war led to increasing domestic criticism, with intellectuals beginning to speak out openly, and Khamenei's method was to use the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps under his control to suppress dissent at home. By 1987, the Iran-Iraq war had entered its 7th year, Iran's economy had collapsed, casualties among soldiers were severe, and the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 598 calling for an immediate ceasefire. Khamenei described that resolution as poison and refused to accept it. But in private, Khamenei approached Khamenei and quietly persuaded him, saying, "Great leader, peace will allow us to rebuild the country and consolidate the achievements of the revolution." On the surface, it appeared to be a pragmatist persuading a stubborn old man. But Khamenei's calculations went far beyond this, because prolonging the war would erode his presidential authority, whereas a ceasefire would free his hands to deal with what he truly wanted to address at the time, namely dealing with his political opponents within the country. In the summer of 1988, Iran agreed to a ceasefire and the war came to an end, but even darker events soon followed. Shortly after the ceasefire was announced, Khamenei issued a secret decree initiating a purge of political prisoners held in prisons across Iran. The order was carried out by an institution known as the Death Committee. They conducted trials of the prisoners in an extremely short period of time. The trial consisted of only one question: were they willing to renounce their political stance? Those who answered no would be hanged on the very same day. The massacre lasted for several months, with the number of victims estimated to be between 4,000 and 5,000, most of whom were members of opposition groups. Although Khamenei did not directly participate in the Death Committee, he publicly endorsed those executions in his radio speeches as the official voice, claiming they were in line with Islamic justice and a necessary step to purge traitors. Montazeri, who was originally designated by Khamenei as his successor, wrote a letter to Khamenei describing the massacre as the greatest crime in the history of the Islamic Republic. As a result, Montazeri was rebuked by Khamenei, removed from his position as successor and marginalised. Khamenei immediately seized upon this opportunity. He was desperate for Khamenei to reflect and appoint him as the successor. He yearned for supreme power. So he began plotting a restructuring of power at the governmental level, weakening his other rivals. He swiftly pushed for the establishment of a constitutional reform committee with the aim of abolishing the position of Prime Minister and concentrating executive power in himself as president. In closed-door meetings, according to recollections, he justified himself to opponents by claiming that the Islamic Republic needed strong leadership to avoid internal strife and the fragmentation of the revolution. Ultimately, the reforms were approved in a 1989 referendum, the position of Prime Minister was abolished, and the powers of the President were greatly expanded as a result. At the same time, the constitutional reforms he promoted also quietly lowered the qualifications required for the Supreme Leader, changing it from having to be a Grand Ayatollah to simply being able to issue religious edicts, thus making it possible for such a person to become the successor and serve as Supreme Leader. This amendment proved useful just a few months later. In June 1989, as Khamenei lay dying in his hospital bed, Khamenei visited him frequently, quietly expressing his loyalty. At the same time, he exerted pressure on the Assembly of Experts through the Revolutionary Guard, spreading rumours that Khamenei wished for him to be the successor and worked to win over key figures in the government and clergy. On 4th June, the day after Khamenei's death, the Assembly of Experts elected Iran's new supreme leader by 74 votes to 60, and that person was Khamenei. Khamenei's rise to power caused quite a stir within Iran's religious circles at the time. According to tradition, the supreme leader must be a Grand Ayatollah, the highest rank of religious scholarship in the Islamic world. At that time, Khamenei's rank was merely Hujjatul Islam, which, to put it plainly, is a mid-level cleric. His qualifications were far from sufficient. So how was this issue resolved? It was quite simple. They amended the constitution. This was the constitutional amendment that Khamenei himself, as president, had pushed for a few months earlier, lowering the eligibility requirements. The threshold was tailor-made for him. Montazeri, who was originally appointed by Khamenei as his successor, publicly stated that this was a coup by Khamenei aimed at seizing Iran's highest authority. Montazeri was a truly influential figure in Iran's religious circles, so his criticism was no small matter. Therefore, after Khamenei came to power, he immediately began purging him. First surveillance, then house arrest. In 1997, Montazeri publicly questioned Khamenei's religious authority, declaring him unqualified. Khamenei then placed him under house arrest in his home in Qum, where he was confined for several years, unable to leave. In the first few years after Khamenei came to power, he did not immediately display the kind of frenzied, all-encompassing control he would later become known for. He needed time to consolidate his power, he needed allies, and he needed people to have a favourable impression of him. So during the 1990s, there was a relatively relaxed window of opportunity in Iran. In 1997, Mohammad Khatami was elected president with 70% of the vote, a result that took many people by surprise at the time, including Khamenei himself. Because Khatami was a pro-Western reformist, he advocated freedom of speech, a civil society, and dialogue with the West. After he was elected, there was a visible increase in the number of newspapers in Iran, student movements became more active, and the space for women to participate in public life continued to expand. On the surface, Khamenei did not stand in the way. In fact, he even promoted and supported some diplomatic openness. But this was not because he truly believed in reform or was genuinely pro-Western. Rather, it was because he needed to gather strength, win over people's hearts, and at that time, he did not yet have the power to lay all his cards on the table. However, this moment arrived in 1999. During this period, out of the public eye, Khamenei was engaged in one particular endeavour, accelerating Iran's nuclear programme. He regarded nuclear technology as a symbol of national sovereignty and as a bargaining chip to counter Western pressure. By the late 1990s, Iran had acquired centrifuge technology through Pakistan and the underground network of scientist A.Q. Khan, and had secretly launched its uranium enrichment program. In 2002, Iranian opposition groups revealed the existence of Iran's secret nuclear facilities at Natanz and Arak during a press conference, causing an international outcry at the time. The response from President Khatami's government at the time was to urgently initiate diplomatic negotiations. In 2003, these diplomatic negotiations yielded positive results. Iran signed the Tehran Declaration, agreeing to suspend uranium enrichment and to open up to inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. At the time, Khatami's guiding principle was that through transparency and making concessions, Iran could integrate into the international community. Although Khamenei reluctantly approved this agreement on the surface, in private he told his confidants that making concessions was humiliating. In private, he instructed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to protect the nuclear program while publicly declaring that nuclear technology was non-negotiable. There was a divergence of opinion between the president and the supreme leader. Khamenei was very keen to remove President Khatami. In 2005, this opportunity arose. That year, there was a change of power in the Iranian government, and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president of Iran. This outcome was not a coincidence, but rather carefully orchestrated by Khamenei. Ahmadinejad was a former member of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a hardliner, anti-Western, and a figure who denied Israel's right to exist. He threatened to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. He was the president Khamenei wanted, an excellent executor, a puppet who would not steal the political limelight from him. After Ahmadinejad came to power, Iran immediately announced the resumption of its nuclear program, restarted uranium enrichment, and withdrew from the previous negotiation framework with the European Union. Khamenei finally stopped pretending. The nuclear program thus advanced at full speed, and international sanctions soon followed. The United Nations, the United States and the European Union imposed round after round of sanctions, crippling Iran's economy. Oil exports plummeted, inflation soared, and the standard of living for ordinary Iranians dropped sharply. But Khamenei's response was not to negotiate. Instead, he invented a new term to justify his actions: the resistance economy. So-called resistance economy, to put it bluntly, meant letting the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps take over the lifeblood of the national economy: oil, construction, telecommunications, imports and exports. The Revolutionary Guard extended its reach into every industry that could turn a profit. The heavier the sanctions, the richer the Islamic Revolutionary Guard became, while ordinary people grew poorer. And the wealth of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard directly enabled Khamenei to push forward with the plans he desired. In 2009, Iran held a presidential election. The reformist candidate, Mir Hossein Mousavi, received a great deal of support, but the results announced that Ahmadinejad had won re-election by a wide margin. The speed at which the votes were counted was absurdly fast, so fast that even the government's own statistical system couldn't keep up. As a result, millions of Iranians took to the streets, with green becoming the colour of their protest. People were all shouting the same thing: "Where is my vote?" This is the largest grassroots protest movement in Iran since the 1979 revolution, and also the moment when the conflict between Khamenei and the Iranian public was at its most intense and most open. Khamenei quickly gave a televised speech characterising the protests as a foreign conspiracy and calling on Iranians to go home. But no one went home. So the Revolutionary Guard and Basij militia took to the streets to begin the crackdown. The most widely known scene was of a 26-year-old woman named Nida Aga Sultan, who was shot in the street. She fell to the ground and her life ebbed away in front of the camera. This footage spread around the world, sparking international pressure. The official death toll announced was several dozen, but human rights organisations estimate it was at least nearly 200. After the crackdown, the purge began. Reformist leaders were placed under house arrest one after another, some for over a decade, and to this day they have not been released. Thousands were thrown into prison, and reports of torture and sexual violence began to emerge from inside the jails. In this way, the Green Movement was crushed, but the anger it left behind did not disappear. Khamenei's proxy wars across the Middle East were also being waged on all fronts. After the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, he sent Revolutionary Guard advisors and Hezbollah fighters to support the Assad regime, as well as backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Shia militias in Iraq. Khamenei organised these forces into a network spanning the entire Middle East, known as the so-called Axis of Resistance. In 2015, the Iran nuclear deal was signed. Iran agreed to limit uranium enrichment and accept strict inspections in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. Privately, Khamenei described this agreement as poison. Their economic pressure forced him to swallow this bitter pill. After the agreement was signed, Iran's economy was able to catch its breath, albeit briefly. In 2018, Trump withdrew from the agreement and reinstated sanctions against Iran. Khamenei's reaction was almost one of barely concealed relief. He had always opposed the West and loathed the United States, and now he had the perfect excuse. Iran immediately accelerated its nuclear program, pushing uranium enrichment levels up to 60%, just one step away from weapons grade. Around 2020, Khamenei's health began to deteriorate rapidly, with increasing reports about his condition from the outside world: cancer, strokes, multiple hospitalizations. His public appearances also became fewer and shorter. His son, Mashhad Khamenei, began to appear more frequently within the inner circles of power. The son of a supreme leader in an Islamic republic founded on opposition to monarchy was quietly taking over his father's network of power. Meanwhile, Khamenei's moves on the international stage were becoming increasingly risky. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Iran became one of Russia's most important arms suppliers. Iranian-made Shahed drones appeared over Ukrainian cities, blowing up power stations and destroying residential buildings. Khamenei packaged this arms deal as a show of solidarity against American imperialism. On the nuclear issue, Iran advanced its uranium enrichment purity to 60%, leaving only one final step, technically, from the 90% required for weapons-grade material. Each report from the International Atomic Energy Agency became increasingly grim as the red lines of the United States and Israel were gradually approached. From that point onwards, Israel began to launch strikes against Iran's nuclear program. Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz and Fordo were subjected to virus attacks, and several Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in assassination operations. Iran's military targets in Syria and Lebanon were struck by hundreds of air raids. Each time, Khamenei never responded directly, but instead retaliated indirectly through proxies such as Hezbollah and the Houthi forces, maintaining a fragile balance on the brink of war while secretly accelerating his nuclear program. This dangerous balance was finally and completely shattered on the 28th of February 2026. A large-scale strike was launched in a joint US-Israeli operation, during which Khamenei was killed. His 37-year rule over Iran thus came to an end. At the time of his death, Iran's inflation rate had remained above 40% for a prolonged period. The economy had been battered to pieces by sanctions, the country's finances had been devoured by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the lives of ordinary people had seen almost no improvement in his final decade in power. In fact, things had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Millions of Iran's brightest and best permanently left the country due to political repression and economic collapse. The so-called axis of resistance, which he had spent decades constructing, quickly descended into chaos after his death. In 1963, a 24-year-old young man was distributing leaflets on the streets of Mashhad, was thrown into SAVAK's prison and comforted his fellow inmates with poetry while inside. In 2026, the same man was blown to pieces in a joint US-Israeli operation. Thus, the mighty hand of history quietly turned the page on this era. The joy of Iranians celebrating in the streets around the world is, in fact, the best epitaph history could give him. Thus, the mighty hand of history quietly turned the page on this era. The joy of Iranians celebrating in the streets around the world is, in fact, the best epitaph history could give him.